Well, happy 224th birthday, friends. Happy 224th birthday, First Unitarian. Wait, okay, I'm going to gallery view. Can we all shake our arms like this? Yay, happy First Unitarian birthday. I love it. We were formed on June 12th, 1796. And I got to tell you, I've been thinking a lot about the history of our congregation, particularly since the pandemic began, because certainly for me, in times of difficulty, I look back to times that were difficult before to try to gain some strength and some stories and some lessons from how either I got through the difficult time before or how my ancestors did, how the communities that I've been part of got through difficult times before. And so I spent a lot of time looking to see how we got through the Spanish flu in 1918. And I did not find that much, let me tell you. But I'm going to tell you how we got through some other difficult times and how we have formed who we are over the past 224 years, which I hope you can draw strength from as I am drawing strength and lessons for how I want to be right now in this moment in history. So, we were founded by a minister who was also a scientist. We were founded under the encouragement of Reverend Joseph Priestley, who was a British Unitarian minister. And back then, Unitarianism looked like a pretty out there branch of Protestant Christianity where God was recognized as one and Jesus was recognized as a great teacher, a great model for how to be, but not lofted up as the Christ up next to God. It was sort of there is one God as opposed to there being three gods, and we follow Jesus's leadership in terms of how to live our lives. That radical message got his church burned down and his home and his lab in England, and he eventually fled to the United States and landed in Philadelphia and helped to form a congregation around those same ideals here. His religion was pretty radical, but the reason that people paid attention to it was because he was famous as a scientist. He's known as the person who discovered oxygen and the person who invented the process for carbonating beverages. So every time you have a glass of soda or every time you have a glass of seltzer, we give thanks for Joseph Priestley. And what part of what his legacy teaches me, it teaches me many things, but is that science and theology have never been in conflict in this congregation, have never been in conflict in this faith. That we always believe that science and our faith exist alongside each other, and that we don't have to choose to ignore what the best science of the day is telling us in order to live our faith fully. That is part of the very fabric of this congregation and our faith as Unitarian Universalists. That's the first thing. That's from 224 years ago. That's where we began. The next thing that happened in our collective life was a pandemic. Back then it was the yellow fever, and yellow fever was a horrible pandemic that struck Philadelphia over and over and over again in the late 1700s and early 1800s. We were formed with a small group of basically British expats in 1796. And within the next few years, about half of them were killed by the yellow fever. A few years after that, the church basically went dormant for a period of 7 years. At first, they were just sort of going dormant from August to November when the yellow fever would be at its height, but eventually they went dormant for 7 years. Our historians call it a silent period, and we don't really know what happened during that time. What we do know is that we survived it, and we came out on the other side as a congregation, even if we had lost many beloved people. Part of what that tells me about right now is that we have survived pandemics before. We were born in the middle of a pandemic, and though it causes harm to us and to our cities and to those we love, and that we lose people, that we as a congregation know how to survive, because we have survived even when we were in the midst of a much a much more vicious pandemic in that it had no real treatment at all, and killed far more people back then. So we were born with our theology and our science always being woven together. We were born in one pandemic. We had to shut down for a while in the Spanish flu in 1918 as well, and we rose again. And this is our third pandemic together. We will survive this one too. Our first settled minister's name was William Henry Furness, and people talk about him a lot here. So if you've been around a little while, you've probably heard of him. He was known as a fiery abolitionist in our city. He didn't actually start preaching abolitionist sermons until 14 years into his ministry. So that's like if I didn't preach a racial justice sermon for another 10 years of being with you, and then all of a sudden became like a firebrand who was preaching about it every week. But it was still very early. 14 years into his ministry was still very early for most white abolitionists to be out publicly talking about abolition back in that day. And so William Henry Furness, he began preaching about abolition. He began preaching about the Fugitive Slave Act. When John Brown led a revolt that was supposed to be an armed slave liberation movement that failed, and he was awaiting execution because they captured him and executed him for leading that revolt. This congregation took up a collection for his family. And when only 5 people were allowed to meet his body when it traveled through Philadelphia and meet his wife who was traveling with his body, our minister was one of them. Our minister and his son were 2 of those 5 people who were allowed to meet that body when the police were trying to push down a massive race riot that was happening around the very idea that John Brown's body was coming through Philadelphia. When William Henry Furness started preaching about abolition, boy, was he met with some controversy. His preachings were met with everything from people's reverence for the current status quo to people's fear of physical violence, being part of a congregation that was preaching that radical message. People desired for public approval. They didn't want to be an out there left congregation. They wanted to be more respectable in the center of intellectual thought in Philadelphia. And they feared possible economic losses because some of the people in the congregation made a lot of money off of slavery. And so over time, some of the influential members of the congregation, they begged Furness to stop preaching about abolition. They begged him to give them warning if he was going to be talking about slavery so that they could avoid coming to church that day. Some of them just got up and walked out of sermons. Some of them stayed and tried to kick him out. They signed a letter to try to kick him out of the pulpit. And others silently armed themselves because they knew that there was a risk that he was going to be assassinated for preaching what he was preaching. And so people would come to church with concealed weapons and an eye to the back door to try to make sure that they could protect him if he when he was at risk for speaking such a radical truth at that time, that slavery was an abomination and needed to end. This is part of our story here at First Unitarian Church. It's a big part of our story, is that we were formed, we were galvanized and also divided by our commitments to racial justice from very early on in our ministry. This was about 180 years ago that this commitment first came into being. And what I take from that is that we are still a congregation who needs to be committed to racial justice, and that it will both galvanize us and cause division within us. And that's going to be part of our story probably always, because that's how oppression works, is that it is complicated and it requires good people to work together to end it, and good people working together to end anything huge brings up disagreement. So my hope is that, like like we did back in his day, that we find a way to stay together, stay moving forward, and stay on the right side of history. So we arose from a white church tradition, from a British church tradition. But about 150 years ago, at least, we've been a multiracial congregation for at least 150 years ago. And we know that because Frances Ellen Watkins Harper joined our church in 1870. I'm going to talk a bit more about Frances Ellen Watkins Harper in a minute, but I'll just say that she is the first woman of African descent, or maybe one of the first two women of African descent to have her writings published in the United States, in addition to being an abolitionist and a suffragette, an essayist, a novelist, a lecturer, and a sought-after poet in her day. One other thing that I have learned this past year, and I'll say that many of you who are historians or who are academics teach me this, and I keep trying to learn this, that history is written by the people in power. And so when you're trying to figure out the history of the people who weren't in power, sometimes what you need to do is look between the lines, right? Because a lot of times it's not actually written in the books. It's written in what is unwritten. And so part of what I've been trying to do is look between the lines of our history and figure out what was unwritten about us. One of the things that I've been looking into in the past few months is that our minister in the 50s, or in the 40s and 50s, Harry B. Schofield, who was here from 1947 to 1957, he is one of two Unitarian Universalist ministers who were the first two Unitarian ministers to officiate gay weddings in our faith tradition. Harry Schofield, we know he officiated a wedding, a gay wedding in 1958 at the earliest, or it's not at the earliest, at the latest. That's the latest we know that he started officiating gay marriages. He finished his ministry here in 1957, and so that marriage that we know of took place in San Francisco. But part of what I'm trying to read between the lines in terms of that history is that I doubt that he showed up in San Francisco having never been connected to the LGBTQ movement, having never worked with LGBTQ people, found sympathy for the plight of LGBTQ people in the 50s in this country, and committed to doing gay union ceremonies in secret. I can't imagine that just came to him just a few months after he left us here. So what I imagine is that some of that work was happening here in our congregation in the 50s, that we were one of probably the early congregations to have a minister who was supporting the LGBTQ movement here in the early 50s. I'm still looking for more information about that. I would love to find out that he was part of some of the gay unions that happened here in Philadelphia in the 50s, but we may never know that story because it was a risk. You put your life at risk by being publicly involved with doing that work back then, or being publicly out back then. But I like to read between the lines and think that that this congregation, out of all the congregations in Unitarian Universalism, had some queer-friendly leadership in the early 50s, and maybe had actual ceremonies taking place in secret here. So this is who our history is. This is our story here at First Unitarian Church. It's an incredible story, and I think many of us feel really proud of some of the powerful moments in our history. One of the things that my partner Kai and I have been talking about this week is a question that was posed to him, which is that when we sit around and wonder, those of us who weren't around during the Holocaust in particular, which is at this point is most of us, or weren't adults during the Holocaust, when we sit around and wonder, what would I have done in the Holocaust? And what would I have done in slavery? Particularly if we were people of privilege. What would I have done in the Holocaust? What would I have done in slavery? And that the answer is, it's whatever you're doing right now. So if you're doing nothing right now, that means that you probably wouldn't have done anything in those times. And if you're figuring it out right now, that means that you're part of the resistance in those times. And so part of what I've been trying to think about when I think about my history, when I think about the history of this congregation, is what were they doing in those times? And what are they going to say about us someday? 224 years from now, what are they going to say about what we did in this time? 180 years ago, what are they going to say started in this congregation at this time? 150 years from now, 70 years from now, what are they going to say about what we did? And so I want to take some time to go a little bit more deep into the legacy of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who is, again, a member here from 1870 to her death in 1911, to look more deeply about what she did with her life and with her time and with who she was as a person. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was probably the best read Black poet of her time. She was sort of an unofficial Black poet laureate in the mid 1800s, mid to late 1800s. And her novels are still well known. Her essays are well known. There is a quote, one of her quotes is part of the waiting area, the sort of art in part of the waiting area as you're going into the Liberty Bell. You will see one of her quotes there. She was an abolitionist and a suffragette, but I think that she actually would say more that she was an activist who was committed to equality for all. So it wasn't just about the abolition of slavery, it was about racial justice. And it wasn't just about women's right to vote, it was about gender justice. One of the things that's really exciting is that there's going to be a statue of her that is going to be placed on the grounds of our State House in Harrisburg. It was supposed to happen, I think, this week. I'm not sure if it's going to happen now. I think everything with the pandemic has been slowed down in terms of celebrating her in particular. But there's been a group of organizations celebrating her life this entire year that we've been a part of, which was going to like end in this great celebration of her statue going up. She will be not only the first African-American woman's statue to be on our State House grounds, she's going to be the first woman, period, to be on our State House grounds. And it's really, her legacy is really powerful. She was a member both at our congregation and at Mother Bethel AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church across town, which was the faith tradition of her upbringing. And so she had a foot in both spiritual communities, this Unitarian spiritual community that was very progressive, but also very arising from the white church tradition, and also this progressive congregation that arose from the Black church tradition. And she was very involved, especially with the AME church. Part of what I'm doing in terms of reading between the lines of her involvement with Unitarian Universalism and why she is more well-read in the AME tradition is that I wonder if Unitarians weren't giving her space to be the leader that she was in our faith tradition. I would bet that that is at least part of the story of her life. Because we know that she fought for racial justice in male-dominated organizations, and people like, including Frederick Douglass, asked her to step down from her leadership role in the American Anti-Slavery Society so that a man could have a seat. This is the kind of sexism that she faced in the racial justice movement at the time. She took leadership roles. She was delegates at conventions, speakers at important events and in important organizations, but was always held down because of her gender. And in gender equality organizations, she was held down because she was a Black woman. One of the things that I find the most powerful about her, though, is that she continued to speak out and speak truth to power within both of those organizations, not just accepting that racial justice was a man's world and gender justice was a white woman's world, but calling for both movements to understand that Black women were part of both of those movements as well and deserved a role in leadership in both of those movements. And so I want to read some of a speech that she gave. This was in 1866 at the Women's Rights Convention in New York, which was participated in by a lot of white women who were also Unitarians. The women's rights movement was like lousy with Unitarian women and some men. But most of those women were white, other than Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And so she speaks about what one scholar calls the double jeopardy of being black and female in a racist, sexist society. And she talks about some of her experience and of Harriet Tubman's experience, who was a contemporary of hers. So she says this to this 1866 Women's Rights Convention. I do not believe that giving women the ballot is immediately going to cure all the ills of life. I do not believe that white women are dewdrops just exhaled from the skies. I think that, like men, they might be divided into three classes: the good, the bad, and the indifferent. And then she goes on to say, you white women speak of rights. I speak of wrongs. I, as a colored woman, have had in this country an education which made me feel as if I was in the situation of Ishmael, my hand against every man and every man's hand against me. In other words, that as a woman of color, that she was forced in opposition both to white women and to men of color, and they were in opposition to her. She continued on and said, let me go tomorrow morning and take my seat in one of your streetcars. And this convention happened in New York. So she says, I don't know if they'll do it in New York, but they do it in Philadelphia. Let me go and take my seat in one of your streetcars, and the conductor will put up his hand and stop the car rather than letting me ride. This is in 1866. She continues on, we have a woman in our country who has received the name of Moses, not by lying about it, by acting it out. And she's talking about Harriet Tubman here. A woman who has gone down into the Egypt of slavery and brought out hundreds of people into liberty. The last time I saw this woman, her hands were swollen. That woman who had led one of Montgomery's most successful expeditions, who was brave enough and secretive enough to act as a scout for the American army, had her hands all swollen from a conflict with a brutal conductor who undertook to eject her from her place. That woman whose courage and bravery won a recognition from our army and from every black man in the world is excluded from every thoroughfare of travel. She continues on, and again, she's talking to a group of mostly white women working for women's suffrage in 1866. She says, talk of giving women the ballot box? Go on. It is a normal school, and the white women of this country need it. And what she means by a normal school, normal schools are sort of like teacher training institutes. And so she said it's a normal school by saying, like, getting the right to vote for women will be training for them in how to be better citizens. That's sort of what she's saying there. Well, there exists this brutal element in society which tramples upon the feeblest and treads upon the weak. I tell you that if there is any class of people who need to be lifted out of their airy nothing and selfishness, it is the white women of America. These are Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's words about white women's fragility to, like, Susan B. Anthony and a bunch of the other, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, that group of women's suffragettes, white women's suffragettes in 1866. They spoke of rights and she spoke of wrongs. And so not only was she calling for the right to vote, she thinks that it would be good to have the right to vote, but she saw the right to vote for women as a chance for them to become more resilient, more courageous in fighting injustice, that they needed a bigger voice to be able to learn how to do that. Because right now they were just calling for their own rights and allowing themselves to be seen as innocent and purely good and always in the right, but just held back from this one part of the of public citizenship. She says, we are bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul. when she was an old woman, she wrote a letter to Francis Grimke, who was a Black Presbyterian male preacher in the DC area, who had written a group of sermons about Southern lynchings and about the right of mostly Black men in the South who were being lynched to due process, even if they had committed a crime. And she wrote to him and thanked him for his leadership, thanked him for his sermons, asked him if she could have another copy because she wanted to give it to Joseph May, who was our minister at the time, because she had heard from his wife that he was going to be preaching about lynchings soon. And a lot of what the white preachers in the city were preaching about lynchings at the time was basically like that the people who were being lynched deserved to die, rather than seeing that people of color are overly policed and unequally treated under the law. And after writing to him, thanking him for everything that he is doing, she was in her late 70s at this time, I think. She said to him, "Is there not an amount of unused power among us? Is there not an amount of unused power among us?" In her gratitude for his leadership, she realized how much power there was in the movements of resistance that needed to be used for greater effect in our country and in the fights for racial justice and gender justice in this world. And so when I look to what my predecessors did in this congregation, I think about speaking truth to power. I think about using all the gifts that I have in service of a better world, which is part of what we talked about last week. And I talk about finding a place for myself, each of us finding a place for ourselves, wherever we can be, wherever we can find a place for one foot or the other, even if we can't all fit our full selves into any one community. So this is a place where multiplicities matter, where many of us are members not only of this congregation, but of an additional faith tradition. Many of us are committed to this place, but also to other work for justice in the world. Many of us sing with this community and make music in other places as well. We are a community that holds those multiplicities together, holds the tension of not always doing things right, not always being in agreement, but still continuing to move forward together towards justice in this world. And so as we go forth today, I invite us to remember part of our history. Remember that science and religion do not need to be seen as opposites, and they never have been here. Remember that we were born in the time of a pandemic, and we've been through several since then, and we will survive this one as well. Remember that it's time for us to speak about racial justice, no matter whether we lose friends, no matter whether we lose money, but that the stakes are very high and that our voices really matter. And remember that even within these movements for justice, there is injustice. And part of our call in this world is to speak truth to power, even when others would say that speaking about injustice within justice communities would divide us. My friends, there is a great deal of unused power among us, even in this congregation. If you're wondering what you would do during the Holocaust, if you're wondering what you would do during slavery, it is what you're doing now. And so, my friends, I hope you will join me in finding a way to use our power more. May it be so, and amen.